The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of a fan that struggled against the heat of a modest Chennai night. A young man sat on the edge of a small iron bed, his shadow stretching across the walls of a cramped room. His name was Sundar. To the neighbors, he was quiet, unremarkable, another boy destined to disappear into the vast machinery of India's anonymity. But inside his chest, there was a restlessness, something he could neither silence nor explain. He stared at the battered notebook on his lap, its pages covered with rough sketches of circuits, flowcharts, and half-written equations. To most, they were meaningless scribbles. To him, they were whispers of a future he wasn't sure he deserved to touch. In those moments, doubt was a constant companion. Doubt that told him he was foolish, that the world wasn't built for boys like him, that the walls around him would always define the limits of his reach. Every evening, he would walk through the narrow streets of his neighborhood, past the broken shops, past the tired workers returning from long shifts, their shoulders bent under invisible weights. Sundar would look at them and wonder, is this my destiny too? A small life, a quiet existence, a story forgotten before it's told? At school, he was invisible. His accent too provincial, his clothes too plain, his family too modest to be remembered. But there was one thing he carried with him like a secret weapon, an unusual gift. He could memorize numbers, patterns, sequences that others forgot instantly. Phone numbers, codes, entire lists etched in his mind after a single glance. It was strange, almost unnatural, and in those quiet moments he clung to it, hoping it meant something, hoping it would one day open a door that life seemed determined to keep shut. But talent alone doesn't erase hunger, or the humiliation of rejection. When Sundar was accepted to study engineering, he felt the air shift. It wasn't victory, it was a dangerous promise. Because for the first time, he was leaving behind the safety of obscurity. He was stepping into a place where failure would be witnessed, where every mistake would be judged, and it terrified him. He arrived on campus with a single suitcase and a heart that refused to slow down. The buildings were enormous, the students confident, their laughter sharp like blades. Sundar spoke softly, moved cautiously, afraid of being seen as less. There were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the dormitory, convinced he didn't belong, convinced the world had made a mistake letting him in. And then came the silence of the phone call that would change everything. His father, a man who worked tirelessly to provide for the family, had taken out a loan. Money they didn't have. Money they couldn't afford to lose. All for Sundar's education. The weight of that sacrifice pressed down on him with suffocating force. It wasn't inspiration. It was a burden. Because now, failure wasn't just his. It was his family's. There was no room for mistakes. He buried himself in books, but the deeper he went, the darker it became. Endless equations blurred together. Concepts slipped away like smoke, and self-doubt grew louder with every passing day. Some nights he wanted to walk away, to escape, to disappear back into the anonymity of his neighborhood. But every time he thought of it, he saw his father's tired eyes, his mother's quiet hands folding his shirts for the journey. And he knew he was trapped. The first risk came not with triumph, but with hesitation. When an opportunity appeared, a chance to study abroad in a place called Stanford, Sundar froze. The idea was absurd. They had no money. He had no connections. And yet, the thought wouldn't leave him. It was reckless, almost selfish, but somewhere in the shadows of his mind, he knew, if he didn't try, he would regret it until the end of his life. He filled out the application at night, his hands trembling over every word, half expecting the paper itself to laugh at him. He mailed it off with the quiet conviction that it would vanish into nothingness, that no one would ever read his name. But when the letter came back, stamped with acceptance, he felt no joy, only fear. because now the impossible had become real. How would he tell his family? How would they afford the cost? The loan his father had taken was already a blade hanging over them. To ask for more was unthinkable, and yet his father said yes, said they would find a way, sighed sacrifice was worth it. In that moment, Sundar realized something terrifying. The people who loved him were willing to burn themselves just so he could walk into the light. And so he left India, carrying not just his suitcase, but the weight of an entire family's faith. America was a different kind of darkness. The silence of unfamiliar streets, the cold stares of strangers, the constant reminder that he was foreign, that he was replaceable. He survived on the cheapest meals, borrowed books, and endless hours in the library. Each day was a negotiation between exhaustion and survival. Each lecture was a battle against the voice that told him he wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't enough. But in those long nights, something inside him hardened. The boy who once whispered in shadows began to fight back. He realized that survival wasn't about brilliance. It was about endurance. It was about standing in the fire long enough for others to burn out first. And then, the first fragile victory. A project, small and almost invisible, but one that caught the attention of a professor. For the first time, someone looked at Sundar and didn't see a poor boy from Chennai. They saw potential. They saw a spark. That recognition was enough to silence the doubt, if only for a moment. It was the first time he breathed without fear. But victory, as always, comes with a shadow, because the more he climbed, the more he realized the stakes. The world he had entered wasn't built for kindness. It was built for competition, for power, for those willing to consume or be consumed. And Sundar, quiet Sundar, would soon have to decide what kind of man he was willing to become. The silence of his past followed him everywhere. The cramped room in Chennai, the weight of his father's sacrifice, the fragile taste of his first victory. They weren't memories. They were ghosts. And each one whispered the same question. How much are you willing to risk to never go back? At Google, the hallways were sterile, the walls lined with silent ambitions. The company was already legendary, a machine that consumed brilliance and spit out mediocrity. Sundar arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, another engineer in a sea of engineers. He wore no arrogance, carried no armor, and that made him vulnerable. In a culture of loud ideas and louder egos, silence was often mistaken for weakness. His first days were brutal. Meetings where voices collided like thunder, ideas weaponized, arguments sharpened. Sundar barely spoke, choosing instead to listen, to measure, to map the battlefield. Some mistook this for timidity. They were wrong. He was memorizing the room, cataloging every word, every gesture, every weakness, the way he once memorized phone numbers on the streets of Chennai. He was silent not because he was small, but because he was preparing. Then came the project that would test him. A new browser. An absurd idea at the time. Microsoft's Internet Explorer was dominant, a giant that no one dared challenge. The skeptics mocked it. Why waste resources? Why provoke a war we can't win? The project was fragile, ridiculed, destined for failure. And yet Sundar raised his hand. He asked to lead, not with confidence, but with a quiet intensity that unsettled those who underestimated him. It was his first real risk inside the machine. If he failed, he would disappear. If he succeeded, he would carve a name into a company that devoured men like him without remorse. The nights returned endless, suffocating. He slept on office couches, drowned in lines of code, haunted by the weight of expectation. Every crash of the program felt like a personal collapse. Every bug was a whisper. You don't belong here. You should have stayed in Chennai. His team doubted him. Executives questioned him. Failure circled like a predator, waiting for the moment of collapse. But Sundar knew something they didn't. He understood endurance. He understood how to survive when survival seemed impossible. The boy who had once walked narrow streets in silence now walked the hallways of Silicon Valley with the same determination. Never give up, not when the world wants you to vanish. Chrome was born not in triumph, but in shadows. Launched quietly, almost invisibly. The skeptics dismissed it. The giants ignored it. But then something happened. People used it, and then more, and more, until the whispers became numbers, and the numbers became undeniable. Sundar had won his first true victory, but the cost was written into his bones. The sleepless nights, the fear, the constant shadow of failure, those scars remained. Chrome wasn't just a browser. It was proof. Proof that the boy from Chennai could stand against giants and not be crushed. But victory is never final. With success came visibility. And with visibility came enemies. In the corridors of Google, power was currency, and Sundar was no longer invisible. Promotions came, responsibilities grew, but so did the knives pointed at his back. Men who smiled at him in daylight whispered doubts in the dark. He's too quiet. He lacks charisma. He doesn't have the ruthlessness to lead. They were wrong. Ruthlessness doesn't always scream. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it endures. As Google expanded, Sundar faced choices that no textbook had prepared him for. Partnerships that smelled of betrayal. Technologies that could change the world, but demanded moral compromise. Decisions that could make or break entire teams. Each choice left a scar. Each scar became a reminder. Leadership is not about brilliance. It is about carrying burdens that others refuse to touch. And then came the final crucible, the call that would place him at the helm of the empire. The title of CEO, the impossible summit. To outsiders, it looked like triumph, a fairy tale arc from poverty to power. But Sundar knew the truth. This was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a darker chapter. Because the higher he climbed, the lonelier it became. At the top, there was no applause, no celebration, only silence. The same silence that haunted him in Chennai, the same silence that followed him at Stanford, the same silence that wrapped around him during Chrome's uncertain nights. The silence of doubt, the silence of ghosts. He looked back at the path, the cramped room, the borrowed books, the nights of hunger, the ridicule of peers, the fragile victories. Each step had carved away a part of him, leaving scars invisible to the world. And yet, he carried them all, because that is the price of ambition. The world remembers Sundar Pichai as the CEO of Google, the quiet man who rose to lead one of the most powerful companies in history. But the truth is darker. His story is not one of brilliance alone. It is a story of sacrifice, of silence, of endurance in the face of crushing doubt. It is the story of a man who carried the weight of a family's faith, the burden of endless risks, and the scars of invisible wars. And beneath the titles, beneath the polished speeches, and the spotlight of success, there remains the boy sitting on an iron bed in a small room in Chennai, staring at a battered notebook, wondering if the world will ever hear his voice. The lesson is not triumph. It is survival. The lesson is not glory. It is endurance. The lesson is not certainty. It is doubt that never truly disappears. Doubt that follows even the powerful, whispering in the quiet hours of the night. What if you had failed? What if you had given up? What if everything you built collapses tomorrow? These questions have no answers. They are scars that never fade, shadows that never leave. But perhaps that is the truth of ambition. Not the promise of peace, but the acceptance of struggle. Not the illusion of safety, but the courage to walk into darkness again and again. Sundar Pichai's story is not a fairy tale. It is a reminder that greatness is born not in triumph, but in fear. That the first step is always the hardest, the loneliest, the most painful. and that even at the top, even with the world watching, the silence of that first step never leaves you. In the end, he remains a man of silence, a man who built his empire not with shouts, but with endurance, a man who carries the ghosts of his past as both curse and fuel. And so, the boy from Chennai walked into the light of the world stage, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor.